Picture this: you're standing in the heart of an ancient city, but something feels off. The towering temples that once echoed with chants are now silent. The bustling market squares, where traders haggled and children played, lie empty. The streets, once worn smooth by countless footsteps, are overgrown with vines. What happened here? Why did the people who built these magnificent places suddenly walk away, leaving their homes to the mercy of time? This isn't just the story of one city. It's a mystery repeated across the globe, from the jungles of Central America to the deserts of the Middle East. Civilizations that thrived for centuries vanished almost overnight, leaving behind only whispers in the ruins. The abandonment of ancient cities is one of history's most haunting puzzles. Think of the Maya, whose grand cities like Tikal and Palenque were swallowed by the jungle, or the Indus Valley, where advanced urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro were deserted, their secrets buried in the silt. These weren't slow declines, they were sudden, dramatic collapses. One generation lived in thriving metropolises, the next saw only ghost towns. Archaeologists have spent decades piecing together the clues, but the answers are as complex as the cultures themselves. Was it a changing climate that turned fertile lands barren? Did war or invasion scatter populations? Could disease have swept through, leaving no one to rebuild? This video is a journey into the shadows of the past, where we'll explore the theories behind these enigmatic disappearances. We'll walk the empty streets of forgotten cities, examine the artifacts left behind, and listen to what the soil, the bones, and the ruins are trying to tell us. By the end, you'll see these ancient abandonments not just as historical footnotes, but as gripping human stories, tales of resilience, adaptation, and sometimes tragic failure. So come along, let's uncover why so many ancient cities were suddenly left to the wind and the dust, and what their stories might mean for us today. To truly grasp why these ancient cities were abandoned, we first need to understand how they thrived in the first place. Picture the greatest cities of antiquity, places like Angkor Wat with its sprawling temple complexes, or Rome with its aqueducts and roads stretching across continents. These weren't just clusters of houses, they were marvels of human achievement, often built in regions blessed by nature. Fertile river valleys, strategic trade routes, and abundant resources allowed populations to grow and cultures to flourish. The Maya perfected astronomy in their jungle metropolises, while the Indus Valley civilization engineered sophisticated drainage systems thousands of years ahead of their time. But success carried hidden risks. The very factors that made these cities prosperous, dense populations, intensive agriculture, vast trade networks, also made them fragile. Take the ancient city of Uruk in Mesopotamia, one of the world's first great urban centers. At its peak, it was a powerhouse of innovation with monumental architecture and a bustling economy. Yet over centuries, the land around it grew salty from constant irrigation, crops failed, and political strife tore society apart. Similarly, the Anasazi cliff dwellings of the American Southwest thrived in a delicate desert balance until prolonged drought pushed that balance past the breaking point. What's fascinating is how many of these civilizations seem to ignore the warning signs. Archaeologists find evidence of deforestation, overfarming, and even civil unrest long before collapse. It's as if the momentum of growth blinded them to their own vulnerability, and when disaster struck, whether a decades-long drought, a sudden volcanic eruption, or the slow poisoning of their water supply, the collapse wasn't gradual. Societies that had weathered smaller crises for generations reached a tipping point where recovery became impossible. The ruins they left behind tell a universal story. No civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to the forces of nature or the consequences of its own ambition. This brings us to one of the most compelling theories for these mass abandonments: environmental catastrophe. Because when the land itself turns against a city, even the mightiest empires have no choice but to walk away. The land itself often holds the most damning evidence of why cities fell silent. Deep in lake beds and ancient tree trunks, scientists uncover stories of catastrophic climate shifts, centuries-long droughts that turned breadbaskets to dust. Take the Akkadian Empire, which ruled Mesopotamia for generations until the rain stopped. Grain withered in the fields, rivers shrank to trickles, and within decades, cuneiform tablets shifted from trade records to desperate pleas for food. The same pattern emerges halfway across the world with the Maya. Stalagmites in Belizean caves reveal a series of brutal dry spells between the years 750 and 950, precisely when iconic cities like Tikal were abandoned. But climate rarely acts alone. Imagine a society already strained by overpopulation, farmers pushing further into marginal lands, nobles hoarding dwindling resources. When the rains fail, these pressures explode. In the Andes, the Moch people built intricate canals to withstand erratic weather. But when a 30-year drought coincided with catastrophic El Niño floods around the year 600, their entire agricultural system collapsed. Similarly, the ancestral pueblones of Choco Canyon carved intricate staircases into cliffs to reach their fields until a 50-year drought in the 1200s made even those desperate measures futile. Yet environmental collapse raises a haunting question. Why didn't these cultures adapt? Some did at first. The Maya shifted crops, the Khmer built vast reservoirs at Anchor. But when conditions worsened beyond living memory scale, survival became impossible. Modern soil analysis shows terrifying parallels. Regions like the Fertile Crescent, once lush, now bear salt crusts from ancient over-irrigation, a warning etched in the earth. But before we assume nature was the sole executioner, consider the chaos left in drought's wake. Starving populations rarely fade quietly. As crops failed, did neighbors turn on each other? Did desperate migrations spark conflicts that toppled kingdoms? The ruins whisper of another grim possibility: that when the environment failed, humanity's darker instincts finished the job. Warfare left scars on the ancient world as deep as any drought. When invaders breached the walls of Hattusa, capital of the mighty Hittite Empire, they didn't just conquer a city, they erased a civilization. Charred grain stores and shattered tablets tell the story. The Sea Peoples swept through around 1200 BCE, burning palaces and temples until nothing remained but smoldering ruins. The survivors fled, and the Hittite language itself vanished for millennia. Troy's fate was equally brutal. Long thought mythical, archaeologists uncovered layer after layer of fire, blackened stones, proof that the city fell to siege not once but repeatedly. Its final destruction so complete that even its location was forgotten for centuries. Yet not every abandoned city shows signs of battle. Walk through the silent streets of Cahokia, the great mound city of the Mississippi, and you'll find no mass graves, no broken weapons, just empty plazas where thousands once gathered. The same mystery clings to Teotihuacan in Mexico, where the Pyramid of the Sun still towers over abandoned apartments. If invaders didn't drive these people out, what did? Here, the evidence points to quieter killers. Imagine a thriving city where trade caravans bring silks and spices, and, unnoticed, something far deadlier. Disease moves faster than any army. When the plague of Justinian ravaged Constantinople in the 6th century, it killed half the city in months. Could similar outbreaks explain why places like Teotihuacan were emptied so abruptly? Skeletons tell grim stories. In some abandoned cities, mass graves reveal victims buried hastily, their bones bearing marks of malnutrition or infection. Yet proving ancient pandemics is tricky, viruses leave no traces in stone. What we do find are clues in the ruins themselves. At Teotihuacan, archaeologists uncovered strange deposits of lime, a disinfectant used to contain contagion. And in Roman Britain, the lavish villas of wealthy landowners were suddenly vacated just as accounts describe a great pestilence sweeping the empire. The terrifying truth is that disease may have been the silent partner of war and famine. A city weakened by drought becomes vulnerable to invasion. Refugees fleeing battle carry sickness to new lands. It's a cycle as old as civilization itself, one that reminds us how interconnected these ancient collapses truly were. But before we assume every abandonment was tragic, consider this: sometimes people left by choice. Disease didn't just kill individuals, it unraveled entire societies. The plague of Justinian wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern that repeated across antiquity. In the Indus Valley, where advanced cities like Mohenjo-Daro once thrived, archaeologists uncovered something eerie. Neighborhoods emptied so swiftly that cooking pots were left on hearths, as if people expected to return any moment. But they never did. Skeletons found in tangled clusters, some clutching their stomachs, suggest a sudden, violent illness swept through. No invaders, no fire, just silence where a bustling city had been. Yet plagues rarely work alone. Imagine a merchant caravan arriving at a bustling port, its sailors unwittingly carrying a deadly stowaway. Trade routes that brought wealth also delivered contagion. The Roman Empire's roads, once celebrated as veins of commerce, became highways for disaster during the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century. Historians describe markets emptying, farms untended, and entire legions too sick to hold their swords. Cities like Alexandria, with their crowded streets and grand bathhouses, turned into death traps. But here's the chilling twist: disease often exploited cracks that were already there. A city strained by famine or war became fertile ground for epidemics. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets mention the curse of Nergal, a cryptic reference to a sickness that followed failed harvests. Likewise, the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt coincided with records of years of hunger and pestilence. When people are malnourished, their defenses crumble, and a simple fever can become a death sentence. The real tragedy: some cities might have survived if not for the domino effect. A plague kills the farmers, so crops rot in the fields. Starvation weakens the survivors, inviting a second wave of disease. Trade collapses, and suddenly, a thriving metropolis can't feed itself. By the time leaders grasp the scale of the disaster, it's too late. The social fabric has unraveled. This brings us to another slow but equally deadly force: economic collapse. Because when the flow of goods and gold stops, even the grandest cities can wither from the inside out. Money makes the ancient world go round until it doesn't. Imagine a city like Palmyra, its markets once overflowing with silk from China, spices from India, and glass from Rome. Caravans stretched across deserts connecting continents, and the wealth they brought built towering monuments. But when those trade routes snapped, everything changed. The Roman Empire's slow collapse didn't just topple emperors. It severed the lifelines of cities that depended on its vast network. Ports like Ostia, once bustling with grain ships from Egypt, became ghost towns. Roads that carried gold and ideas fell into disrepair, and without trade, even the grandest cities withered. Yet trade was only part of the story. Some civilizations mined their way to ruin. Take Easter Island, where the obsession with carving those iconic Moai statues led to deforestation so severe that soil eroded into the sea. No trees meant no canoes for fishing, no firewood for warmth, just a starving population trapped on an island they'd stripped bare. Similarly, the ancient copper mines of Cyprus turned entire mountainsides into wastelands. For centuries, the metal fueled economies across the Mediterranean, but when the veins ran dry, the cities that relied on them faced brutal choices. Here's the tragic twist: scarcity often sparked chaos rather than innovation. In the final days of the Maya, murals show nobles feasting while peasants starved. Tax records from Mesopotamia reveal desperate farmers selling children to pay debts when crops failed. When resources vanish, societies don't calmly adapt, they fracture. The wealthy hoard what's left, the desperate revolt, and trust in leaders evaporates. Archaeologists find evidence of this everywhere, in the burnt palaces of Ugarit, in the hastily built walls around Mycenae, even in the smashed statues of Akhenaten's abandoned capital. But why couldn't these collapses be stopped? Part of the answer lies in something fragile yet powerful: social contracts. A city isn't just bricks and roads, it's an unspoken agreement that everyone plays their part. Farmers grow food, soldiers provide protection, rulers maintain order. When faith in that system crumbles, so does everything else. The Greenland Norse clung to European farming methods as the climate cooled, refusing to learn from the Inuit who thrived in the ice. Pride, tradition, or sheer desperation can blind societies to solutions staring them in the face. And that brings us to the darkest trigger of all, when scarcity turns neighbor against neighbor, and the very bonds holding a civilization together snap under the weight of hunger and fear. Social upheaval leaves marks just as deep as any invasion or drought, but these scars are often harder to see. Take the grand cities of the Harappan civilization, where archaeologists uncovered something peculiar in the final layers. The carefully planned streets, once uniform and orderly, show sudden clusters of makeshift huts crammed against elite neighborhoods. Jewelry workshops were looted, grain stores burned. No foreign weapons, no signs of conquest, just a society tearing itself apart from within. This pattern repeats across history. In the dying days of the Roman Republic, the gap between rich and poor grew so vast that senators dined on roasted peacock while mobs rioted for bread. The Maya murals at Bonampak depict a similar unraveling. Nobles in jade finery watching as bound captives, likely starving farmers, were sacrificed to gods who no longer answered their prayers. When people feel the scales of justice have tipped beyond repair, their loyalty to the city itself can vanish overnight. Yet inequality alone doesn't explain every abandonment. Sometimes it wasn't the oppressed who walked away, it was the disillusioned. The ancient Khmer capital of Angkor offers a haunting example. Inscriptions describe kings draining the treasury to build ever grander temples, while canals silted up and rice yields dropped. At some point, the people simply stopped believing. They slipped away into the jungle, leaving the god kings to preside over empty courtyards. This raises a provocative question: could faith itself have driven these abandonments? In Anatolia, the Hittites abandoned their capital after oracles predicted doom. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones left behind kivas, their sacred ceremonial pits, filled with ritual objects, as if closing a chapter they no longer wished to read. When the stories that bind a society together lose their power, the physical city becomes a hollow shell. The most chilling examples blend all these forces. At Teotihuacan, the statues of rulers were deliberately decapitated, their fragments buried in mass graves. Here, drought may have sparked hunger, hunger bred rage, and rage turned against the very idea of kingship. The people didn't just flee, they erased their own history before leaving, which brings us to the quietest yet most profound force of all, not the collapse of walls but of meaning. When the shared dreams that built a city fade, even the grandest monuments become mere stones waiting for the wind. Faith can move mountains, but it can also empty cities. Across the ancient world, sacred sites that had drawn pilgrims for centuries were suddenly left to the elements, not because the stones crumbled, but because the beliefs that once animated them changed. The Olmec heartland of La Venta offers one of the most striking examples. Here, colossal stone heads, each weighing up to 20 tons, were deliberately buried by the very people who carved them. Archaeologists found these monuments arranged in precise patterns, then carefully interred, as if closing a holy chapter. No signs of violence, no evidence of invasion, just a profound spiritual shift that rendered the old ways obsolete. Religious revolutions rarely happen in isolation. Often, they're sparked by crisis. Imagine a drought so severe that prayers to the rain gods go unanswered year after year. Or a volcanic eruption so violent it seems the earth itself is rebelling. In these moments, faith doesn't just evolve, it fractures. At Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known temple complex, evidence suggests the site wasn't abandoned so much as ritually closed. Pillars depicting fearsome creatures were buried under thousands of tons of soil, as if the builders were sealing away an era they no longer recognized. Yet some shifts were more gradual. The ancient city of Petra thrived as a crossroads of gods where Nabatean deities shared space with Roman and Egyptian ones. But as Christianity spread, the temples carved into rose-colored cliffs lost their purpose. Pilgrims stopped coming, priests moved on, and the city's lifeblood trade tied to spiritual journeys dried up. Similar fates befell the oracle sites of Greece. Delphi, once the center of the known world, faded as people turned to new philosophies and faiths. Here's where disaster and belief collide. When Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii, survivors didn't just rebuild elsewhere, they questioned why their gods had allowed the catastrophe. In Mesoamerica, the eruption of Ilopango around the year 530 was so devastating that Maya chroniclers recorded it as the day the sun died. Entire cities relocated, not just to escape the ash, but to distance themselves from lands now seen as cursed. The most poignant abandonments blend faith with necessity. At Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, the Great Sun Circle, a sacred calendar of wooden posts, was dismantled tree by tree. Analysis of the wood shows it was cut during a prolonged drought, suggesting a heartbreaking choice. When survival hung in the balance, even the holiest sites became firewood. Which brings us to the ultimate disruptor, forces so violent they reshaped not just cities but continents. Because when the earth itself rebels, no belief system, no matter how ancient, emerges unchanged. The ground beneath their feet became their greatest betrayer. Imagine waking to the roar of Thera's eruption around 1600 BCE, a blast so violent it ripped the island apart, sending tsunamis crashing into Crete's Minoan palaces. Frescoes still cling to the walls of Akrotiri, frozen in ash, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray wasteland left behind. But here's the chilling part. It wasn't just the initial disaster that doomed these cities. Thera's eruption spewed sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, triggering years of failed harvests across the Mediterranean. Survivors didn't just lose homes, they faced a world where the sun itself seemed to dim. Earthquakes delivered a different kind of reckoning. At Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, archaeologists found walls collapsed not once but multiple times. Each rebuild added layers to the tell, a mound of rubble and resilience. Yet after certain quakes, people walked away for good. Why? Because seismic chaos often exposes deeper vulnerabilities. Underground springs might vanish, leaving cities without water. Trade routes could be severed by landslides. Even if the stones could be stacked anew, the trust in the land itself was broken. Flood myths echo this trauma across cultures. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hindu story of Manu, even the biblical Noah, all speak of deluges so vast they reset civilizations. Sediment cores from the Black Sea reveal a possible source. Around 5,600 BCE, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam, drowning coastal settlements in a cascade of salt water. Survivors wouldn't have just lost crops, their very understanding of the world would have shattered. How do you replant when the soil is poisoned? How do you pray to gods who drowned your neighbors? The stark truth is this: natural disasters rarely work alone. A volcano might bury a city, but famine and disease finish what the ash began. An earthquake topples walls, but it's the loss of faith in leaders who promised divine protection that drives people away. At Mycenae, the mighty citadel that survived invasions crumbled after a quake disrupted its water supply. Starving warriors abandoned their bronze armor in the streets. But perhaps the most revealing clue lies in what survivors carried with them. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, a city abandoned after repeated floods, archaeologists found something unexpected: heirlooms buried in house floors. Not valuables, but mundane objects: a child's toy, a grinding stone. These weren't hurried evacuations, they were farewells. When the land turns hostile and the gods fall silent, sometimes the only answer is to walk away, not just from a place, but from the very idea of it. Which brings us to the ultimate question: could these ancient collapses hold warnings for our own cities? Because the forces that toppled them haven't disappeared, they're just biding their time. Rarely does history offer simple explanations, especially when entire cities vanish. The real story often lies in the collision of multiple disasters, each amplifying the other until survival becomes impossible. Take the Maya, whose civilization didn't just succumb to drought. Tree rings from the Yucatan reveal a brutal dry spell, yes, but also something darker: warfare spiking as rains failed. Inscriptions at cities like Dos Pilas boast of kings burning rival towns for captives, even as their own reservoirs ran dry. Then came the final blow of political fragmentation. As crops withered, alliances shattered. Nobles who once pledged loyalty to divine rulers now barricaded themselves in fortified compounds, hoarding what little food remained. The result: a death by 1,000 cuts, environmental stress, desperate violence, and the unraveling of the very systems that held society together. Half a world away, Cahokia's mound builders faced a similar perfect storm. At its peak, this Mississippi Valley metropolis rivaled medieval London in size, but soil samples tell a grim tale. Decades of overfarming stripped the land of nutrients, just as a prolonged cold snap, called the Little Ice Age, shortened growing seasons. Starvation bred unrest. Archaeologists find evidence of palisades hastily erected around elite neighborhoods, as if the ruling class feared their own people. Then, around the year 1300, the Grand Plaza, where thousands once gathered for ceremonies, was repurposed as a mass burial site. The message in the bones is clear: when nature and social order fail simultaneously, even the grandest cities can collapse under their own weight. What makes these multi-causal collapses so chilling is their unpredictability. A single disaster might be survivable. The Maya had weathered droughts before, Cahokia had rebounded from smaller conflicts. But when environmental crises, political instability, and resource shortages converge, they create a feedback loop of despair. The Khmer Empire's Anchor faced this fate. Its vast reservoirs, engineered to withstand monsoons, proved useless when shifting trade routes drained its wealth, just as silt choked its canals. No single crisis doomed Anchor. It was the interplay of climate, economics, and failing infrastructure that turned a powerhouse into a ghost city. Perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in how these civilizations misread their own fragility. At Choco Canyon, the ancestral Pueblones built elaborate roads connecting sacred sites, even as their aquifers drained. In Mesopotamia, rulers commissioned ever grander ziggurats while salt poisoned their fields. It's as if the very symbols of power blinded them to the cracks spreading beneath their feet. This isn't just ancient history. Modern cities from Cape Town to Phoenix grapple with water scarcity, while rising seas threaten coastal megacities. The ruins of the past whisper a warning. Civilizations rarely fall from one blow, but from the cascade of crises they failed to see coming. And that's what makes the next chapter so vital, because sometimes the clearest answers lie in the stories of individual cities, where human choices and natural forces collided with world-ending consequences. The Maya collapse stands as one of history's most dramatic vanishing acts, a civilization that didn't just fade, but shattered. Between the years 800 and 900, cities like Tikal and Calakmul, once pulsing with life, were swallowed by the jungle. Towering temples where priests once tracked the stars became silent monuments to a lost age. But this wasn't an extinction, it was a dispersal. The Maya people didn't vanish. They walked away from their grandest achievements, leaving behind clues etched in stone and soil. Drought emerges as the prime suspect. Stalagmites from caves in Belize tell a harrowing story. Rainfall dropped by nearly half during this period, with particularly brutal dry spells between the years 800 and 950. Imagine reservoirs that once held enough water for tens of thousands now cracked and empty. Farmers who relied on precise seasonal rains watched as their maize withered in the fields. Yet drought alone doesn't explain why some cities fell faster than others, or why certain regions rebounded while others were abandoned forever. The inscriptions reveal another layer: political chaos. Maya rulers claimed divine authority, their power tied to ceremonies guaranteeing rain and harvests. When those rains failed, faith in kings crumbled. At Dos Pilas, glyphs boast of a king burning a rival city, only for his own capital to be torched decades later. Warfare wasn't new to the Maya, but now it grew desperate. Palink's final monument shows a ruler clutching a spear, his face gaunt, not the portrait of a victor, but a man clinging to power as the world unraveled. Beneath the surface, another crisis brewed. Pollen samples tell a startling tale. By the year 800, deforestation had transformed the landscape. The Maya burned vast tracts of forest to make plaster for their temples and palaces. Without trees, soils eroded, and the delicate balance of their slash-and-burn agriculture collapsed. At Capon, archaeologists found hillsides stripped bare, their once fertile topsoil washed into rivers. A civilization that mastered astronomy and mathematics had, in its hunger for grandeur, undermined the very land that fed it. Yet the most haunting question isn't why the Maya left, it's why they never returned. Some cities, like Lamani, endured, but the great political and cultural hubs lay abandoned for centuries. The answer may lie in resilience. Smaller, scattered communities could adapt shifting crops, finding new water sources, while the rigid systems of classic Maya cities became traps. When the old ways failed, people chose flexibility over monument building. This wasn't a single catastrophe, but a cascade. Drought strained resources, kings fought over scraps, and farmers fled the crumbling order. The jungle reclaimed the rest. The lesson: even the most brilliant civilizations can be undone by ignoring the fragile web that sustains them. Now, let's journey to another enigma, the Indus Valley, where entire cities were emptied with no signs of war or disaster, their streets left perfectly preserved, as if waiting for inhabitants who never came back. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro tell a silent story. Unlike other ancient cities scarred by war or disaster, This metropolis of the Indus Valley shows no signs of violent end, no burnt palaces, no mass graves, not even broken weapons littering its meticulously planned avenues. Instead, the ruins whisper of something far stranger, a civilization that simply walked away. Around 1900 BCE, the people who built one of the world's first flush toilets, who designed grid-patterned cities with sophisticated drainage, who traded lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and carnelian from Gujarat, these master engineers and merchants began to leave. And they never came back. What makes this abandonment so baffling is how advanced the Indus Valley was. Their cities boasted uniform brick sizes, standardized weights for trade, and neighborhoods with raised foundations to avoid floods. Archaeologists have found no evidence of kings or temples, just a society that thrived on cooperation and commerce. Yet precisely because they left no grand monuments to rulers or gods, their collapse leaves fewer clues. The script etched into their seals remains undeciphered, a linguistic puzzle that could hold the key to their disappearance. Theories abound, but one stands out: the rivers betrayed them. Satellite imagery reveals that the mighty Gaga Hakra, once the lifeblood of this civilization, began shifting its course around the time of the decline. Farmers who relied on predictable floods found their fields either parched or drowned. Unlike the Nile or the Tigris, which could be tamed with irrigation, the Indus rivers were wild, prone to sudden avulsions that could render entire regions uninhabitable. Soil samples from Mohenjo-Daro show layers of silt, evidence of repeated catastrophic flooding. Yet water wasn't the only factor. Dig deeper into the ruins, and you'll notice something peculiar. The final layers of the city show shoddy repairs, houses built over once sacrosanct drainage systems. It's as if the social contract that held this orderly society together was fraying. Trade goods from distant lands become rarer, suggesting economic networks were collapsing. Without central granaries or palaces, the Indus cities had no buffer against slow-moving disaster. The most haunting possibility, they chose to leave. Unlike the Maya or the Akkadians, who clung to power until the bitter end, the Indus people may have simply adapted. Recent genetic studies show their descendants didn't vanish. They migrated east, blending into new cultures. Their legacy lives on in India's traditions of urban planning and craftsmanship, even if their cities became ghosts. But before we assume environmental change was the sole culprit, let's follow the trade routes westward to Mesopotamia, where clay tablets mention a land called Meluha, rich in ivory and ebony. Suddenly, around 1800 BCE, those references stop. Did the collapse of one civilization help destabilize another? The answers might lie not in abandoned cities, but in the fragile web of connections that bound the ancient world together. Mesopotamia's Fertile Crescent was supposed to be paradise until the land itself turned traitor. The great Sumerian city of Ur, home to the legendary ziggurat, rose and fell like the tides of the Euphrates. At its peak, its canals nourished fields of barley so plentiful they fed thousands. But beneath this agricultural miracle lurked a slow poison. Centuries of irrigation left the soil crusted with salt, visible even today as ghostly white patches in satellite images. Ancient tablets tell the story. Crop yields plummeted by nearly 2/3 over 3 centuries. Farmers watched as barley, once resilient, gave way to salt-tolerant but less nutritious wheat, then to barren patches where nothing grew at all. The very water that gave life now carried destruction. Yet nature wasn't Mesopotamia's only foe. Just as harvests failed, invaders descended like locusts. The Elamites sacked Ur around 2000 BCE, dragging its last king away in chains. Later, the Babylonians and Kassites tore through the weakened region. What's chilling is how these disasters intertwined. Droughts forced pastoralists toward cities, sparking conflicts that disrupted trade. Starving armies then ravaged the farms that remained. A cuneiform tablet from this era reads, "The famine was so severe that parents ate their children. Still, the people returned. Ur was rebuilt 7 times, its ruins forming layers like tree rings of resilience." Even the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving story, hints at this cycle. Its flood myth mirrors real sediment evidence of Euphrates deluges that drowned cities, yet the tale ends with rebirth. For millennia, Mesopotamians endured, until one day they didn't. The final abandonment holds a sobering lesson. By the time the Parthians ruled the region centuries later, Ur's ziggurat was already an ancient relic. The canals silted up, the fields baked under salt crusts, and the knowledge of cuneiform faded. A civilization that invented writing, law, and the wheel ultimately fell to the unintended consequences of its own ingenuity. Now shift your gaze across the ocean to the arid cliffs of the American Southwest, where another civilization made eerily similar choices. The Anasazi didn't build ziggurats, but their towering pueblos at places like Mesa Verde and Choco Canyon were just as ambitious. And like Ur, their story ends with empty rooms and unanswered questions. The cliff dwellings of the ancestral pueblones cling to canyon walls like silent sentinels, their empty rooms telling a story of resilience and sudden flight. Around the year 1300, families who had weathered centuries in these stone fortresses packed their belongings and walked away. They left behind pottery still stacked in niches, sandals tucked into rafters, even half-woven baskets, artifacts so intimate it feels as if the occupants might return any moment. But they never did. Tree rings from the Colorado Plateau reveal why. A drought so severe it stretched across 50 years, the worst in over a millennium. Springs dried up, corn withered in terraced fields, and the ingenious water capture systems the ancestral pueblones engineered could no longer sustain them. Yet nature's cruelty was only part of the story. In the ruins of once sacred kivas, archaeologists found charred roof beams and arrowheads embedded in walls. Some sites show evidence of cannibalism, a taboo act that hints at desperation or ritual violence. When survival hung by a thread, even tight-knit communities could fracture. But this isn't a tale of extinction. The descendants of these cliff dwellers didn't vanish, they adapted. Oral histories of modern Pueblo peoples like the Hopi and Zuni speak of migrations guided by spiritual signs. They settled along rivers like the Rio Grande, where water was more reliable, and traded the towering cliffs for open villages. Their pottery designs, religious ceremonies, and even words persist today, a living thread connecting past and present. What makes the ancestral Puebloan story so poignant is its echoes across time. Like the Maya and the Indus Valley, they mastered their environment until the environment shifted beyond recognition. Their cliffside homes, once shelters, became traps, and when the cost of staying outweighed the peril of leaving, they made the only choice left: to walk into the unknown. Now, let's cross the Atlantic to a city whose fate was sealed not by drought, but by deliberate destruction. Carthage rose from the shores of North Africa as a Phoenician jewel, its harbors bristling with ships and its warehouses overflowing with dye, silver, and ivory. Yet its ashes tell a different story, one of conquest so total that its very memory was nearly erased. Carthage's fate was sealed not by nature, but by the ruthless calculus of war. For over a century, this North African powerhouse had been Rome's greatest rival, its ships dominating Mediterranean trade, its armies led by the legendary Hannibal. But in the year 146 BCE, after a brutal 3-year siege, Roman legions broke through its walls. What followed wasn't just defeat, it was erasure. Ancient historians describe streets running red, temples stripped of gold, and 50,000 survivors sold into slavery. the Senate decreed that not one stone should stand upon another. Even the land itself was cursed, salt allegedly scattered across fields to ensure nothing would grow. Carthage, once a city of 500,000, became a smoldering ruin. Yet here's the twist: the Romans, pragmatic as ever, couldn't ignore the city's strategic value. By 44 BCE, Julius Caesar ordered its rebirth. Within decades, new forums and amphitheaters rose atop the ashes, their foundations literally built over the old. This second Carthage flourished for centuries, proving that even the most violent ends can have unexpected sequels. But the original city's destruction raises a darker question: why obliterate a place so completely? The answer lies in fear. Rome didn't just want to win, it wanted to exterminate the very idea of Carthage as a rival. The salt myth, whether literal or symbolic, speaks to that desire, not just conquest but a warning etched into the earth itself. Contrast this with Angkor Wat, a city that faded rather than fell. While Carthage's end came in fire and screams, Angkor's was a slow retreat into silence. Its temples weren't toppled by invaders but gradually reclaimed by roots and vines. The Khmer Empire's decline wasn't marked by a single catastrophe, but by 1,000 small unravelings. Canals silted up, monsoon patterns shifted, and pilgrims stopped coming. Where Carthage's ruins were dramatic, Angkor's are poetic, its towers still standing but empty, like a breath held too long. Both cities teach us something profound about abandonment. Sometimes it's violent and decisive, other times so gradual it's barely noticed. But in every case, the ruins whisper the same truth: no civilization, no matter how mighty, is permanent. The next time you walk through a bustling modern city, remember, it too is just a chapter in a story that future generations may one day piece together from fragments in the dust. Angkor Wat stands as a monument to both human ambition and nature's patience. At its height, this sprawling temple complex was the center of the Khmer Empire, a civilization that mastered water like no other. Thousands of miles of canals, reservoirs, and intricate irrigation systems turned the Cambodian jungle into a breadbasket, supporting a population of nearly 1 million. But by the 15th century, the great city was silent. The jungle swallowed its towers, its moats filled with roots, and its grand causeways vanished under centuries of soil. What went wrong? The first cracks in Angkor's foundation were literal. The Khmer built their empire on water. Monsoon rains filled massive reservoirs like the West Barre, which could hold over 50 million cubic meters. But tree rings from ancient cypresses tell a troubling story. The rains began to fail. Decades of weaker monsoons left canals parched, rice paddies cracked, and the delicate balance of the city's hydraulic system in chaos. Without water, the empire's lifeblood drained away. Yet climate alone didn't doom Angkor. Inscriptions reveal another threat: political unrest. As resources dwindled, rival factions fought over control of the remaining water, while distant provinces broke away. The Khmer kings, once seen as divine, now faced rebellions from starving subjects who no longer believed in their power to command the skies. Then came the final blow: invasion. The Siamese armies, sensing weakness, sacked Angkor not once but repeatedly. By the 1400s, the capital was indefensible. But here's the twist: the Khmer didn't vanish. They simply moved. The court shifted south to Phnom Penh, trading grandeur for survival. Angkor wasn't destroyed, it was abandoned, its people adapting rather than dying. The jungle's victory wasn't sudden, it was a slow reclaiming, vine by vine, of what humans had borrowed. Now, consider modern megacities like Jakarta or Miami. Jakarta sinks inches every year as aquifers are drained. Miami's streets flood at high tide. Like Angkor, they face environmental threats amplified by human choices. But the parallels run deeper. Both ancient and modern cities suffer from what archaeologists call infrastructure inertia, the tendency to keep relying on systems even when they're failing. The Khmer kept building temples as their canals silted up, just as we keep paving over wetlands while sea levels rise. The lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable, but that adaptation must outpace disaster. Angkor's ruins remind us civilizations don't end when the last stone falls. They end when the last idea fails. The ruins of ancient cities aren't just relics of the past, they're mirrors reflecting our own vulnerabilities. Modern metropolises from New York to Shanghai may gleam with steel and glass, but they face eerily familiar threats. Rising seas lapping at Miami's foundations, aquifers beneath Mexico City sinking faster than buildings can be shored up, and mega-droughts draining reservoirs from Cape Town to California. The difference: we're not staring at these crises with Bronze Age tools. Satellite networks track desertification in real time, engineers design flood-resistant architecture, and global alliances share resources in ways the Maya or Khmer could never imagine. But technology alone isn't a shield, it's how we use it. The Indus Valley civilization had advanced drainage systems, yet they couldn't stop their rivers from shifting course. Our challenge is to learn not just from their innovations, but from their blind spots. Take water management. Los Angeles, like ancient Petra, depends on distant sources. Pipelines stretch hundreds of miles to quench its thirst. But when a 2023 atmospheric river flooded those same pipelines, it exposed a fragility reminiscent of Angkor's silted canals. Meanwhile, Tokyo's underground cisterns, designed to prevent catastrophic flooding, echo the Maya's reservoir systems, which worked until consecutive droughts outstripped their capacity. The lesson isn't that these solutions fail, it's that they must evolve faster than the threats. Then there's the social fabric. Ancient Teotihuacan's collapse accelerated when elites hoarded grain. Today, income inequality in cities like Sao Paulo creates parallel crises where luxury skyscrapers overlook favelas with intermittent water access. Archaeologists find evidence of this pattern across millennia. When trust in institutions erodes, resilience crumbles. Yet modern cities have tools those societies lacked: democratic accountability, global aid networks, and the ability to course correct before collapse becomes inevitable. But progress breeds its own risks. The very connectivity that lets us share solutions also spreads vulnerabilities. A cyber attack on a power grid could paralyze millions faster than any Hittite siege. Climate refugees, like the pastoralists who flooded Mesopotamian cities during droughts, now cross borders in unprecedented numbers, testing political stability. And while ancient cities fell one by one, today's globalized economy means a single metropolis failing, whether from a pandemic or a financial crash, can send shockwaves worldwide. This brings us to the myths that cloud our understanding. Hollywood paints abandoned cities as scenes of overnight catastrophe, but most collapses were slow burns, generations of small failures compounding. Likewise, the idea that war alone topples civilizations ignores how often conflict follows environmental strain. The truth is messier and more illuminating. By examining these nuances, we can rewrite the script not as a doomed sequel to ancient tragedies, but as a story where foresight triumphs over fate. Ancient cities abandoned to time have always sparked wild theories: extraterrestrial architects, divine curses, or even portals to other dimensions. But peel back the layers of sensationalism, and you'll find something far more compelling: the messy, all-too-human drama of civilizations pushed to their limits. Take the myth of Atlantis, a tale spun by Plato to make a philosophical point, not a historical one. Yet real abandoned cities don't need embellishment. Their stories, written in cracked pottery and collapsed roofs, reveals struggles we still recognize today: climate crises, political strife, economic collapse. Archaeologists don't chase ghosts, they follow evidence. When a city like Mohenjo-Daro shows no signs of invasion but layers of silt from repeated floods, the answer isn't aliens, it's hydrology. At Tikal, pollen samples tell of deforestation so severe it altered local rainfall patterns. These aren't mysteries solved by waving a wand or invoking ancient astronauts. They're puzzles pieced together with soil chemistry, tree ring data, and painstaking analysis of trash heaps. Even the so-called cursed cities often trace their downfall to mundane horrors: lead pipes poisoning Roman elites, or salinized fields starving Mesopotamian farmers. The allure of supernatural explanations says more about us than the past. It's easier to imagine a single dramatic cause, a volcanic eruption, an alien intervention, than to grapple with the slow, interconnected failures that topple civilizations. But the truth is richer. When archaeologists sift through the ruins of Cahokia, they don't find evidence of a curse. They find exhausted soils, overcrowded neighborhoods, and signs of social unrest. The real horror isn't some unknowable force. It's the recognition that these cities fell not from outside destruction, but from the weight of their own choices. Yet this doesn't make their stories less awe-inspiring. If anything, understanding the human scale of these collapses makes them more haunting. The Maya didn't vanish because the gods abandoned them. They adapted, dispersing into smaller communities when their cities became unsustainable. The ancestral Pueblones didn't flee supernatural wrath. They moved toward water and survival. These aren't tales of defeat, but of resilience. So next time you hear whispers of cursed cities or alien builders, listen instead to the quieter voices in the ruins. The farmer who carved irrigation channels until the rivers ran dry, the trader whose routes collapsed when empires frayed, the child whose toy was left behind in a hurried escape. Their stories, grounded in dirt and bone, are stranger and more profound than any myth. Modern archaeology has transformed from treasure hunts to high-tech detective work, peeling back layers of time with tools our predecessors couldn't have dreamed of. Take LiDAR, for instance. Laser pulses fired from aircraft pierce dense jungle canopies to reveal the ghostly outlines of cities swallowed by vegetation. In the Guatemalan lowlands, these scans exposed sprawling Maya suburbs and hidden causeways, proving their civilization was far more extensive than we'd imagined. But technology doesn't stop at mapping. Isotope analysis of human bones acts like a dietary time machine. By studying chemical signatures in skeletons from Teotihuacan, scientists discovered that many residents weren't native to the city. They'd migrated from distant regions, likely drawn by trade or opportunity. Then there's the humble pollen grain, nature's tiny historian. Layers of sediment from ancient lake beds preserve these microscopic time capsules, telling us what crops grew or failed centuries ago. In Anatolia, pollen records show a sudden shift from wheat to drought-resistant barley around 1200 BCE, a silent testament to climate stress that aligns with Hittite texts pleading for grain shipments. Even broken pottery tells a story. Chemical fingerprints in ceramic fragments trace the rise and fall of trade networks. When Indus Valley seals stop appearing in Mesopotamian digs around 1800 BCE, it's not just a stylistic change, it's evidence of an economic collapse that severed connections between civilizations. Yet the most poignant clues often come from the smallest details. At Catalhuyuk, footprints preserved in dried mud reveal a child running through a doorway 7,000 years ago. In Cahokia, traces of corn pollen in ancient hearths show families still cooking meals even as their society frayed. These aren't just data points, they're intimate glimpses of lives interrupted. Now consider what happens when all these threads converge. When tree rings confirm a drought, skeletons show malnutrition, and pottery styles abruptly change, we're not just studying abandonment, we're witnessing the moment a city's heartbeat faltered. But there's one factor that ties these clues together: movement, because when survival hangs in the balance, people don't just vanish, they go somewhere. Migration isn't always a desperate flight, sometimes it's a calculated adaptation. The ancestral Puebloans didn't abandon Chaco Canyon in panic. They left in stages, relocating to areas with reliable water. Genetic studies of modern Pueblo peoples confirm their lineage stretches back to these very migrants. Similarly, the so-called Sea Peoples, who toppled Bronze Age empires, may have been climate refugees themselves, driven from arid homelands to raid richer shores. Even the Maya diaspora had logic families moved to coasts where fishing supplemented failing farms. What's fascinating is how these journeys reshape cultures. When the Moch fled drought-stricken valleys for Peru's northern coast, they didn't just survive, they reinvented their art, blending old symbols with new influences. Migration isn't an endpoint, it's a transformation, and that's the ultimate lesson whispered by the ruins. Collapse isn't always an ending, sometimes it's just a crossroads. Migration reshapes civilizations more often than it destroys them. When we picture ancient cities swallowed by jungle or buried in sand, it's easy to assume total abandonment, a clean break with the past. But the truth is far more nuanced. Take the Maya. While grand cities like to call emptied, their people didn't vanish. They simply moved down from towering temples into smaller, more manageable villages near lakes or coasts. Archaeologists find their pottery styles evolving in these new settlements, their traditions adapting rather than disappearing. Similarly, the Indus Valley's sophisticated urbanites didn't blink out of existence. Genetic studies trace their descendants eastward, blending into the fabric of later Indian cultures. These weren't collapses, they were recalculations, strategic retreats from unsustainable ways of life. So why the myth of total abandonment? Partly because ruins capture our imagination more than continuity. A crumbling pyramid makes for a dramatic story. A dispersed population adapting over generations feels less cinematic. But also because the scale of departure was often staggering. When Cahokia's mound builders left their ceremonial plazas, or when Anka's engineers walked away from their vast reservoirs, the sheer emptiness left behind suggested something final. Yet even in these cases, the exodus was rarely absolute. At Cahokia, smaller communities persisted along the Mississippi, keeping fragments of the old ways alive. In Cambodia, oral traditions among modern villagers still recount tales of the kings who ruled before the jungle returned. The deeper question isn't why people left, it's why they didn't come back. Here, the land itself holds answers. In Mesoamerica, soil samples reveal that centuries of intensive farming had leached nutrients from the earth, while deforestation altered local rainfall patterns. The Maya could rebuild their homes, but not their ecosystem. Likewise, the Indus Valley's shifting rivers didn't just disrupt one city, they redrew the entire region's agricultural map. Returning wasn't an option when the very geography had turned hostile, yet adaptation came at a cost. The Maya who moved to coastal villages lost their intricate calendars and astronomical knowledge. The Indus diaspora left behind standardized weights, urban planning, and that still undeciphered script. What looks like resilience from one angle is also cultural amputation, the price of survival. And that tension between preservation and reinvention echoes in every migration story, ancient or modern. Now, consider the oasis cities of the Silk Road, like Palmyra or Petra. When trade routes shifted, their wealth evaporated. but their people didn't die out. They became nomads, shepherds, or farmers in narrower valleys. Their descendants might not even know their ancestors once commanded caravan empires. Migration doesn't just change where people live, it rewrites who they are. And that's the silent lesson of these abandoned cities. Sometimes, the greatest monuments aren't the ones left behind, but the ones carried in memory. Easter Island stands as one of history's most chilling cautionary tales, a civilization that literally soared off the branch it sat on. At its peak, this remote Pacific paradise was lush with towering palm forests, its people carving those iconic moai statues with stone tools. But pollen samples tell a grim story. By the time Europeans arrived in the 1700s, the island was a barren grassland. Every last tree had been felled, some to transport statues, others for fuel or canoes. Without trees, soil eroded into the sea. Without canoes, fishing became impossible. The very act of honoring their ancestors had, in a cruel twist, doomed their descendants. Yet this wasn't an isolated tragedy. Across the ancient world, civilizations grappled with ecological tipping points. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets from lament wheat fields yielding to salt crusts, a consequence of centuries of irrigation without drainage. Modern satellite images still show the white scars of this salinization, ghostly fingerprints of a once fertile land. Similarly, the Mayas' plaster addiction had devastating costs. To build their dazzling white temples, they burned vast tracts of forest for lime production. Soil analyses reveal that as canopy cover vanished, temperatures rose, rainfall patterns shifted, and the delicate balance of slash and burn agriculture collapsed. Leadership often accelerated these disasters. On Easter Island, elites likely competed to erect ever larger moai, consuming resources in a spiral of one-upmanship. In the Maya city of Capon, rulers kept commissioning monuments even as deforestation triggered mudslides that buried farmland. Power blinded them to the cracks spreading beneath their feet. Contrast this with the ancient Nabateans of Petra, who engineered intricate water channels to sustain their desert city. Their rulers prioritized survival over spectacle until Roman annexation disrupted their systems. The terrifying lesson: ecological collapse is rarely sudden. It's the sum of 1,000 small choices, each defensible in isolation, but catastrophic together. Modern deforestation in the Amazon or aquifer depletion in India follows the same pattern. The ruins whisper a warning: no civilization is exempt from nature's ledger. But here's the twist: some societies did course correct. In medieval Iceland, early settlers stripped birch forests for pasture, triggering erosion. By the 1400s, laws strictly regulated tree cutting and sheep grazing, allowing fragile soils to recover. Similarly, the ancestral Pueblones abandoned Chaco Canyon's grandeur for smaller, sustainable settlements near reliable water. Their retreat wasn't defeat, it was adaptation. This raises a haunting question for our own cities. Will we heed these ancient lessons or repeat their mistakes as the climate shifts? The answer may lie not in technology, but in the wisdom to recognize limits before it's too late. Leadership failures often write the final chapters of collapsing civilizations, not with dramatic battles, but through slow, corrosive mismanagement. Take the late Roman Empire, where emperors like Caligula and Nero squandered the treasury on personal whims while barbarians pressed the borders. Tax collectors stripped provinces bare, and by the time Diocletian tried to save the economy with price controls, trust in the system had already evaporated. The Maya faced a similar unraveling. Inscriptions at Yaxchilan boast of a king capturing his rival, only for his own city to fall into chaos decades later as droughts worsened and factions fractured. Power became a game of musical chairs, with rulers too busy fighting each other to notice their world crumbling around them. Yet leadership failures weren't always homegrown. Enter the Sea Peoples, a shadowy coalition of raiders who appear in Egyptian records around 1200 BCE, toppling empires from Anatolia to the Levant. Their origins remain one of archaeology's greatest whodunits. Were they displaced Mycenaeans fleeing Greece's collapse, climate refugees from Sardinia? Or opportunistic pirates exploiting weakened kingdoms? The Egyptians, who barely repelled their attacks, carved chilling accounts of these. Foreigners who came from the sea in warring ships, none could stand before them. Cities like Ugarit burned to the ground, their desperate letters begging for reinforcements left unsent in the ruins. But here's the twist: the Sea Peoples might not have been mere destroyers. Some scholars argue they were migrants pushed by famine or upheaval, their violence born of desperation. A Hittite tablet describes grain shipments sent to the lands of the Sea Peoples during a drought, suggesting even rivals recognized their plight. This reframes their raids from mindless invasions to a domino effect of systemic collapse. When crops failed and kings hoarded resources, the desperate turned into conquerors. The lesson etched in these ruins isn't just about bad leaders or external threats. It's about the fragility of systems under stress. Whether it's Roman emperors ignoring inflation, Maya kings waging vanity wars, or the vacuum that empowered the Sea Peoples, the pattern repeats. Elites who prioritize short-term power over long-term survival accelerate their own demise. And that's a warning that echoes far beyond ancient history. The Sea Peoples remain one of history's most enigmatic destroyers, a storm that swept across the Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, leaving shattered empires in their wake. Egyptian temple walls depict them as fearsome warriors with horned helmets, their ships bristling with weapons as they razed coastal cities. But who were they? Theories swirl like the dust of their destruction. Some scholars argue they were displaced Mycenaeans, their own kingdoms crumbling as Greece's Bronze Age palaces burned. Others suggest they hailed from Sardinia or Sicily, drawn into chaos by drought or famine. The most haunting possibility: they weren't a single people at all, but a desperate coalition of refugees, mercenaries, and pirates united by hunger and opportunity. Their timing was devastatingly precise. Just as the Hittite Empire strained under drought and internal strife, the Sea Peoples struck. Clay tablets from Ugarit, a thriving port city, capture the panic. One letter pleads for reinforcements that never came. "The enemy ships are already here," it reads. "They have set fire to my cities and done great harm." Within decades, Ugarit was abandoned, its grand palaces reduced to ash. The Hittites, once a superpower, vanished so completely that their language remained undeciphered for millennia. Even Egypt, the mightiest kingdom of the age, barely survived their onslaught. Pharaoh Ramses III immortalized his victory at Medinet Habu, but the reliefs tell a darker story. This wasn't a triumphant battle, but a desperate last stand against an existential threat. Yet the Sea Peoples' legacy isn't just one of destruction. Their raids expose the fragility of interconnected civilizations. The late Bronze Age was a time of thriving trade: tin from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all flowing along routes that stretched from Mesopotamia to Britain. When the Sea Peoples disrupted these networks, the shockwaves were catastrophic. Copper shipments stalled, starving empires of the bronze needed for weapons and tools. Palaces that relied on imported luxuries to reward loyal elites suddenly found their power crumbling. It's a pattern we've seen before. When trade collapses, so too do the systems that depend on it. This brings us to the quieter killer lurking behind the swords and smoke: economic disintegration. Because once the ships stop sailing and the markets fall silent, even the grandest civilizations can starve in plain sight. Trade networks were the invisible threads that held ancient civilizations together, and when those threads snapped, the consequences were catastrophic. Picture the bustling ports of the late Bronze Age, where ships from Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia exchanged not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and even culinary traditions. Tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, and amber from the Baltic flowed along routes that stretched thousands of miles. But around 1200 BCE, this intricate web began to unravel. Ships stopped arriving, markets fell silent, and within decades, entire cities found themselves cut off from the lifelines that sustained them. The collapse of trade didn't just mean fewer luxuries, it struck at the heart of survival. Bronze, the alloy that gave the era its name, required tin and copper from distant regions. Without these imports, weapons couldn't be forged, tools dulled beyond repair, and even everyday items like pins and needles became scarce. In Hittite Anatolia, tablets lament the sudden absence of tin shipments, forcing smiths to recycle old bronze or resort to inferior iron. But the crisis went deeper than material shortages. Trade wasn't just about goods, it was about trust. When merchants stopped coming, alliances frayed, and elites who once relied on imported finery to display their status found their authority crumbling. A Mycenaean king's palace might still stand, but without tribute from abroad, his warriors had no reason to remain loyal. Yet the most haunting question isn't why trade collapsed, it's why some cities never recovered. Take Ugarit, a thriving Syrian port whose ruins contain desperate letters pleading for grain and troops. After its destruction, no one rebuilt. The same silence echoes at Troy, where layers of ash mark violent ends, but also an eerie reluctance to resettle. Here, cultural memory may hold the key. Imagine a generation that grew up hearing stories of famine and raids, of gods who no longer answered prayers. Would they risk returning to a place synonymous with trauma? Modern parallels abound. Chernobyl's exclusion zone isn't uninhabitable because of radiation alone, but because its name carries the weight of collective dread. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't a single event, but a cascade of failures. Trade routes severed by piracy or drought-triggered shortages, which sparked unrest, which invited invasion. Yet amid the ruins, glimmers of adaptation shine through. In Cyprus, where copper mines once fueled empires, survivors shifted to smaller, fortified settlements, trading grandeur for security. The Phoenicians, inheritors of this shattered world, turned crisis into opportunity, pioneering new trade networks that would later birth the alphabet we use today. Collapse, it seems, isn't always an end sometimes. It's just the painful birth of something new. Some places carry the weight of their own tragedies long after the last inhabitant is gone. Troy rose from its ashes multiple times, its layers telling stories of destruction and rebirth. Yet just a few miles away, Mycenae, once the seat of legendary kings, lay abandoned for centuries, its massive lion gate standing guard over empty halls. Why rebuild one city and shun another? The answer may lie in the stories people told about these places. After disaster struck, some ruins became woven into cultural memory as cursed ground, their very names spoken in whispers. In ancient Mesopotamia, the fallen city of Akkad was said to be so hated by the gods that even birds refused to fly over it. The Maya avoided certain collapsed cities, believing them gateways to the underworld. These weren't just practical decisions, they were rooted in deep-seated fear. The power of these taboos becomes clearer when we examine why some sites remained empty while others were repurposed. Roman builders scavenged stones from Etruscan ruins but left the nearby cursed city of Veii untouched. In medieval Europe, locals steered clear of crumbling Roman villas, convinced they were haunted by spirits. Even natural disasters left psychological scars. The survivors of Pompeii's eruption refused to dig out buried valuables, as if the ash itself carried a curse. This pattern repeats globally. The ancestral Pueblones avoided Choco Canyon long after drought forced them out, while the Khmer never resettled Anka's ceremonial center, letting the jungle reclaim what was once sacred. Ghost towns today trigger similar unease. Modern ruins like Pripyat near Chernobyl or California's Bodie attract curiosity, but also dread places where time stopped abruptly, heavy with stories of sudden loss. Psychologists call this ruin aversion, a primal hesitation to disturb sites associated with trauma. Perhaps this instinct explains why some ancient cities, no matter how strategically valuable, were never reclaimed. When every stone whispers of famine, war, or plague, the past becomes a warning too visceral to ignore. Yet these abandoned places hold another lesson. Resilience isn't always about returning. Sometimes it's about carrying forward what matters. The Maya who left Tikal didn't lose their culture, they adapted it to new homes. The survivors of the Bronze Age collapse didn't rebuild identical palaces, they forged new societies from the fragments. The silence of ruins reminds us that civilizations don't truly end, they transform, leaving behind both cautionary tales and quiet testaments to human ingenuity. In their emptiness, these cities ask us the most haunting question of all. When the ground beneath us shifts, will we cling to what was, or have the courage to imagine what could be? The empty streets of these lost cities echo with warnings and wonders alike. They teach us that even the grandest civilizations are threads in time's tapestry, durable, but never unbreakable. Look at the Maya, whose astronomical precision still dazzles modern scientists, or the Indus Valley's plumbing systems that rivaled those of 19th century London. Their brilliance endures even as their walls crumble, yet their downfalls, whether from salted fields in Mesopotamia or the silent creep of desertification at Anka, whisper the same urgent lesson. No society is immune to the consequences of ignoring its own fragility. But these ruins are more than cautionary tales. They're testaments to human ingenuity's stubborn persistence. When Teotihuacan's rulers fell, their pyramids didn't vanish. They became sacred sites for the Aztecs, who marveled at these, place where men became gods. The Roman roads that once fed Carthage's destruction later knit medieval Europe together. Even in collapse, these cities seeded rebirth. Their art, their inventions, their hard-won knowledge slipped into the bloodstream of history, resurfacing in unexpected ways. The aqueducts of Petra inspired modern engineers, while the Maya's drought-resistant crops are now studied by climate scientists. What's most haunting isn't the abandonment itself, but how ordinary it often was. There was no single moment when the last citizen of Cahokia turned for a final glance at the towering mounds, no ceremonial closing of the gates at Mohenjo-Daro. Just a slow accumulation of small departures until one day the plazas were empty. That quiet unraveling holds a mirror to our own world, where the greatest threats aren't always fiery cataclysms, but creeping deserts, rising tides, and the quiet erosion of trust. Yet hope lingers in the ruins too. The Pueblones who left Choco Canyon didn't vanish. They carried their stories south, weaving them into new communities. The Khmer's descendants still tend the rice paddies around Angkor Wat, now a symbol not of failure but resilience. These cities remind us that endings are also beginnings, if we're wise enough to learn from them. So as you walk through your own city today, think of the echoes beneath your feet. The same forces that shaped Tikal's fate, climate, leadership, innovation are at work now. But unlike the ancients, we hold their blueprints in our hands. Their ruins are our compass. Now it's your turn. Which lost city story speaks to you? Is it the maritime empire of the Minoans, swallowed by tsunamis? Or perhaps the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, abandoned with such care? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep unraveling history's greatest mysteries together. Don't forget to subscribe. Every click is another step into